We're delighted to have Eric Hurst giving macroeconomic dynamics of labor market policies with Eleanor, who's here. Is Patrick here?
Patrick.
AWOL. Okay, anyway.
Perfect.
Go for it.
The title of the paper is shifted a little, but the content of the paper has not. We're just trying to broaden it a little bit. So let me tell you a little of what we're thinking about, and then we could kind of go into the details. So my introduction is very short. That's like 3 slides. So there's been a lot of discussion recently about market power on the part of firms, and then potentially, if such power exists, what are some policies that we might want to consider to potentially correct that market power? That's part 1. Part 2, those policies you hear a lot about recently, about raising the minimum wage potentially nationally to some very large levels, or expanding the scope of other policies like the EITC. Simultaneously, we know there's a large amount of heterogeneity across workers in the data. We know that from the wages they earn, and that even earns, within education groups, there's just a huge amount of variation of types. Third thing we kind of know is if we're going to want to think about these policies that are going to target certain types of workers, like with the minimum wage or the EITC, that hits some parts of the distribution, we might then care about the extent to which the firms might be willing to substitute away from those workers if they become more expensive. So that elasticity of substitution across workers is going to be a key component of the potential efficacy of some of these policies. And when I say across workers, it could be between workers and machines, or a whole bunch of other types of input substitutability. And so the last thing I'm going to say is there's a tension in the labor literature to the extent to which firms are willing to substitute across inputs at different horizons. So what do I mean by that? So many of you have heard, of papers like, by Larry Katz and Kevin Murphy. That's just one of the many papers that show that there is a very high elasticity of substitution over longer periods of time across workers from different education groups. That firms, are willing to substitute low educated workers for high educated workers with some sort of elasticity. And that elasticity is about 1.5. I cite that paper, but there's been 1,000 papers since then that find estimates in that range. We also have within education groups some work by David Card with Tom Lemieux, and then again a handful of others since that show that within education groups, workers are even more substitutable. So if John and I are roughly similar and John becomes more expensive, they might switch away from John towards me with an elasticity of some number that's pretty big, like 4 or 5. So these medium to longer run elasticities of substitution are rather large, at least from estimates of the labor literature. But we also know the labor literature estimates very short run elasticities to some policies, like when the minimum wage changes. And so there is a bulk of the minimum wage literature finds that upon impact of a minimum wage change, and we'll talk about some of this today, that employment doesn't move too much. Maybe it goes up a little, maybe it goes down a little, and there's a discussion of whether it's down a little or up a little, but most of the bulk of the literature is in relatively small, short-run responses in employment to the minimum wage.
Between those two literatures bigger than you suggest. Katz and Murphy is about annual fluctuations around a trend, right? That's kind of, I wouldn't call that
doing
long.
5-year averages. I mean, so Katz and Murphy is like they're done. It's not annual. They're pulling over these 5-year kind of horizons.
I misremembered then.
Yeah. And Cardinal Mu is very much in that similar range. Yeah.
You look at huge or small changes. For small changes, you find very little. For big changes,
that's going to be. We're going to talk about exactly that non-monotonicity today and some of the stuff. So let me kind of now get into what the paper is going to be about. So what I'm going to be doing in the paper is going to be developing a framework to assess the distributional income impact of various labor market policies, and we're going to focus most on the minimum wage today and some on the EITC. The framework is going to include a reason for those policies to exist. We're going to have some monopsony power on the part of firms in the labor market. We're going to have rich worker heterogeneity, and we're going to have some adjustment costs to firm input. We're going to model it in a specific way, which is going to allow for short-run elasticities to be small, but because of those adjustment costs over time, those elasticities could be longer. We're going to parameterize the framework using kind of data from the US labor market. And then, as I said before, we're going to then evaluate both qualitatively and somewhat quantitatively the effects of various labor market policies like a $15 minimum wage or an expansion of the EITC. John, yes.
My 2 cents in the EITC is less about offsetting monopsony power, but offsetting the disincentives of social programs. If you're going to take away $1 of benefits for every $1 people earn, well, let's subsidize earning to try to get them back to work. Does that matter or anything you're doing?
I mean, yes and no. So there's John saying there's a lot of other policies out there that are interacting with these 2 policies. We're going to allow these 2 policies to interact, but not some of the others.
Also, the employment margin
Yeah.
involves.
Yeah, and so we're going to, so let's, as we go through, you're going to see, so to answer John's question, yes, we're going to have all of those incentives in an optimizing way that are going to be there. I'm not going to horse race it against 72 policies, but I'm going to only have these 2 policies. I'm not going to have a means tested TANF program or something in the background as well, but we could think about, but I really want to highlight the dynamics. And so this is what whatever the paper is going to be about. We're going to think about how the adjustment dynamics are going to be important for studying these distributional effects to different policies. And I'm going to highlight, and it's kind of not unrelated to what John said, but I'll be more precise as we go through, that the transition dynamics to different policies are going to differ from each other. And I'm going to show you that the transition dynamics of the minimum wage are going to be different than the transition dynamics for the EITC for economically fundamental reasons. And we'll kind of highlight what those are. I'm going to show that for large changes in the minimum wage, low wage workers are going to be helped significantly in the short run. But as firms start adjusting their input mix, they're going to be hurt in the long run. And for a large expansion of the EITC, low-wage workers are still going to be helped significantly in the short run, but I'm going to show you the benefits are going to even be larger in the long run. So the minimum wage, long run, is going to hurt some of the low-skilled workers. The minimum wage of the EITC in the long run, it's going to reinforce it. And the part of the reason is kind of related gently to what John was saying, but we'll be more precise. It's going to matter whether the firm or the government is paying the marginal cost of these transfers to the workers, whether the firms face the incentive to substitute away or not. I'm then going to kind of talk about what we were saying there. The model is going to highlight a lot of non-monotonicities in policy changes. Small changes and large changes are going to be very different from each other. And because the small policy changes might just reduce the monopsony distortion, but the bigger you get, firms are going to start facing the incentive to substitute away. And I'm going to show you that kind of concretely as we go through our framework. And then I'm going to have just a couple more bullet points, and then we're going to get into the model. But a lot of what we're doing is trying to inform the large empirical literature that often find well-identified policy changes that are small in the data, and they look at short-run responses. And then they want to make predictions about large changes and long run. And I'm going to show we have to be cautious about making such predictions from the data that we tend to identify. And that both on the size of the policy, small versus large, and the timing of the policy, short run versus long run. And I think a lot of what we're going to do is kind of highlight the key theoretical forces through the lens of the model that are going to determine when those short run policy, the short run responses of small policies is informative about long or large. It depends upon some parameters. And so we're going to try to be very specific about those economic mechanisms as we go through.
So elasticities are not constant.
Elasticities are not constant, either time or size.
So the constant elasticity remains the case that a small input gives a small output. So you're not giving sufficient credit to the importance of this finding.
Well, I want
things like, this is a big issue in trade theory. You should say the elasticity is remarkably higher.
Well, that's what I'm going to try to say, and maybe I didn't say it as close here, but the whole talk is going to be about the timing of the elasticity, when the elasticity is going to depend upon the time horizon, which is going to be how much time it takes to adjust inputs. That's one of the things in that last bullet point, but also the extent of monopsony power, the degree of input substitutability. All of those are going to determine what makes the elasticity state in time, or policy size and time specific. Yeah.
Are you going to measure monopsony power?
I'm going to take from the literature a range of estimates, and I'm going to show you how from the literature, in these range of estimates, how the results change across these range from the literature.
There's another dimension to this elasticity question, which is the horizon as a shock. So here it looks like you're thinking about permanent shocks. So say I'll
Oh,
permanently change policy.
I'm going to show you permanent versus transitory as we go through, but all my shocks are going to be MIT shocks. Can I say that in this room? Which are basically going to be unexpected, and then they're going to be permanent or temporary, but they're going to to be in that dimension.
As
And so
temporary chair of the meeting, I'm going to rule out questions about what are you going to do?
Exactly. I'm all for that.
Well, I'm going to get in now. So now I'm going to get into the
Unless
model.
you start delaying too
No,
much.
now I'm going to get into the model. Now that's kind of the background. And so what I'm going to do is kind of set up the framework. I really want to think about the qualitativeness, of the mechanisms that were going to be key to the results I'm going to show. And then I'm going to talk briefly about the quantification, how I'm going to take some stuff from the literature as kind of targets and then do some robustness around there. And then I'm just going to show you some results. And so I'm hoping that we could get to the results maybe in about 15 minutes. And then the whole rest of the talk is just going to be about kind of the results in the economic mechanisms. But I do want to get a little bit of the framework on the table. So let's talk. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to describe the heterogeneity on the worker side. I'm going to then describe the production structure, both in the long run, and then how we get differences between the short and long run. And then I'm going to talk about the monopsony part of our model, how I'm going to introduce monopsony into this model. So we're going to be in those three parts. So let's talk about the worker heterogeneity first. This is the simplest. Households are going to be defined by the education group to which they are exogenously born, which could be high education, which think about as a bachelor's degree or more when I take it to the data, or low education, which is going to be less than a bachelor's degree. And then they're also conditional on being born into an education group. They're going to have some latent ability, Z. And some of us, John and I, are both low educated. He might be more productive than me, even though he's going to have a higher Z in terms of our notation than I do. So an individual in our model is going to be their latent productivity in the education group which they're born. For the things I'm really going to focus on today, you can just think about being a low education group, but we are allowing for some substitutability in the data between the two. There's going to be each one of these individual eyes are going to belong to a large family. We could talk about that later on. And then there's going to be lots of large families. We don't want the workers to have any of the power in this model.
Difference if you don't explicitly have tangible capital as a potential substitute for.
I'm going to allow for it, and it's quantitatively not going to be important. And I'll show you the production structure when we come through, and there's going to be capital floating around too. In mu, just so you know, that's going to be something that's going to tell us how many of each Z type there is, and we're just going to fit that to match the wage distribution in the data. Production structure, and I'm going to break up the production structure in the long run, and then we'll talk about the short run production structure after that. So firms are going to use heterogeneous labor, okay, by education group and Z, and capital in the production of a homogeneous output good. There's going to be three margins of substitution. This first one I'm going to talk about is by far the most quantitatively important in our analysis. So I'm going to spend the most time on that, but I'm also going to allow in the background for these other two margins of substitution. There's going to be CES aggregator of labor within each education group. So if John and I are low educated, there's going to be some elasticity of substitution between us in the low educated group. And I'm going to talk a lot about that on the next slide. And then we're going to give me 1 second, Sebastian. And then I'm also going to allow for elasticities of substitution across education groups. And I'm also going to allow for elasticity of substitution between capital and a broad labor aggregate. And I'll show you all of those equations in general, but you could think about the three margins of substitution we're going to allow for is labor-labor substitutability within an education group, labor-labor substitutability across education groups, and the substitutability between labor and capital. Sebastian.
So in the last slide, you mentioned that you use the Z's to match the distribution of income.
Yes.
But I wonder if this matters relative to an alternative where it reflects different monopsony power. Some workers have lower bargaining power. That's why they get lower wages.
Yes.
And when you do so
I'm going to tell you, I'm going to make assumptions on what my monopsony power is going to be when you see that coming up. My monopsony power is going to be constant across workers, and all the wage variation is going to then come from Z. I'm not going to have heterogeneity because the literature, as far as I could tell right now, doesn't have any sort of empirical estimates to say whether the low part of the distribution has more monopsony power or less monopsony power. In some sense, you might think they might be captured more by firms, but in the other sense, they switch jobs quite a lot. And so and I think from what the literature has shown so far, we have not found, but if we ever found an estimate, we could embed that into our model, but right now we don't have that. So, but once I show you the monopsony part, we could come back to this, but Sebastian's already foreshadowed, one assumption we're gonna have a constant markdown of wages across workers of Z types.
My vague understanding of the facts is there's a lot of wage variation just on where you are and which company you work for. If you're a janitor at Apple, you get paid a lot more than if you're a janitor somewhere else. That's going to be greater skill in your model, or?
Yeah, so in the back, so let me start with the data first, and then we'll come back to the model. So in the data, so the people who try to decompose how much wage variation is due to worker effects versus firm effects, plus the sorting, the vast majority is worker effects.
Oh.
And so almost like a 10-to-1 ratio. Now, there's a sortative part in between. And then is that a worker effect or a firm effect? But in terms, I would say the consensus from this, David Cardwork, Pat Klein, Jean-Marc Robin have all tried to do these worker firm fixed effects. So think in the back of your mind, about 60% of the wage variation is pure worker effect, about 5% of the variation is firm effect, maybe 5 to 10%, and then the rest is the assortative
I'm
matches.
just wrong.
Yeah, you're just wrong. So
70% according to recent.
it could be even higher. Those are the lower estimates. So that's fair. Okay, so let me talk to you now about this first labor substitutability. This is literally the model that Card and Lemieux used. Two parts of this is going to be equation 1 and equation 2 are literally Card and Lemieux. There's just going to be some elasticity of substitution fee that's going to govern the substitutability of workers within an education group. So John's making $7 an hour. I'm making $10 an hour. If John's minimum wage goes up to 8, the workers are going to substitute, potential firms are going to substitute towards me with some elasticity in the long run of fee. Okay.
So why do you even have the education groups?
Yeah, that's
Just so you can say, hey, we can fit their 1.5 for their aggregation.
Yeah.
But more disaggregated, there's something you could have done. Quantitatively would have been similar. If you just-
very similar again. And so Pete's question is, why do we even have this other nest in equation 2 of allowing for 2 education groups? So now I'm going to allow for elasticity of substitution alpha between these 2 education groups. That is Katz and Murphy, and that is literally Card and Lemieux, when they estimated their model, was equation 1 and 2. And so that allows us to map a little bit either, but it's adding nothing quantitatively to us to have this second education group. Because when we talk about the minimum wage in the EITC, it is 99% of the workers treated are in the low education group. And so in our model, when I even show you results later on, I'm never even going to show you the high skilled stuff because nothing interesting is going on there. The high education group. Chris.
This might be related. Is the fee different for the high and the low education group? And do we
It
have
was not. So Card and
evidence?
Lemieux actually estimated the fee to be exactly the same between the 2 groups. Again, they have a range, but it's in the 4 to 6 range for both of them. Okay, so equation 2 is going to be exactly Pete's question. We're going to allow, it's not going to be quantitatively important because nothing's really happening to the high educated group in this model. And then we're also going to allow for some substitutability between broad labor and capital with some elasticity of substitution here. We're going to assume Cobb Douglas as our baseline. Again, we're not getting a lot of traction empirically when we start moving around with this. We do a lot of robustness. So that'll be in the background as well. But almost all of the variation that we're going to talk about is going to be this fee, the labor substitutability within an education. But we allow these other margins as well.
So how do I think about Corv? You didn't go the Corv route of having capital be complementary with skilled
Yes.
labor and substitutable with unskilled. Is
The
that
first
because
version of the paper was all Corv.
Okay.
Quantitatively, it just wasn't adding any extra kick in for the kind of the policies that we're doing. So we stripped it down and simplified it. But we did have a core version of this. But even with their estimates, we just weren't getting an extra quantitative bite. It's really when a $7 worker has to be paid 14, they're willing to switch within there, but it's not so much with the capital. So, now, why do we have capital at all, you might ask? Well, we might have, oops, I'm going the wrong way. Capital at all. Because we do want some adjustment costs in the background. And so now we are going to have our floor of adjustments. So what's going to happen? That's the long run production structure. What's happened in the short run? There's a putty clay adjustment on the firm. So firms set up their production facility. There's a couple of cash registers. There's in the restaurant, there's a grill, there's some fryers. And it just takes time to alter their mix of machine and workers such that the two match each other. So our putty clay, what that means in our setup is that capital in the long run is going to be just what I showed you, CES across all those components. But in the short run, it's essentially Leontief. It is fixed. Once you install your machines, it's matched to a worker. And so if you want to adjust your worker types, that's fine. But you're going to have to adjust your machines. And that happens relatively slowly over time. Steve.
As I understand the model, you haven't introduced a distinction between adjustments to a local increase in the minimum wage and say a national one. Because you might think for McDonald's, they're going to not care if one city raises its minimum
Exactly.
wage.
Yeah, so there's no regional. So Steve's 100% right. We thought about that, but we've abstracted from all of that for exactly your reason.
Well, I guess I didn't get to the reason yet. It seems to me it's probably important, but it's hard to get evidence on it. So it might be hard to model.
So there's two. Let me just answer Patrick. What I'm going to think the question Steve should be asking, and it might be related to the one he's actually asking, which is when we are thinking about national minimum wage changes, there's no local anything in here. Now, part of the reason is a lot of the work on the minimum wage comes from the local component. Yeah, almost all of it. Exactly. In there, think about you're in Idaho and you're at a Starbucks and Idaho raises the minimum wage. Starbucks isn't going to retool all of their production functions. So that's going to bias again to smaller empirical responses in the short run. And so I'm going to match empirical responses in the short run. For us, it's going to come from a lot of the putty clay structure. But Steve's right. If we're going to the data, a lot of that data might not be one-for-one matching with a model in the aggregate.
But not for Starbucks, but other things. One of the responses is going to be to move production across state lines.
Yes.
Which is,
So we thought about a version, not this paper, but we're thinking about what happens when the national minimum wage to the south, where you put a $15 minimum wage and there's a lot of production. They're just going to move all production out of the south, and that's going to be devastating in terms of some of the
local minimum wages.
Yeah.
More of that.
Yeah.
But so you're talking about long and short run elasticities, and this has got to, since the elasticities in the previous equations were all had nothing to do with time.
Yes.
This is where the long and short.
This
run
is all the distinction, and the parameter that governs that is basically the depreciation rate of your capital. So as your capital starts depreciating away, you're going to build in new capital, and as you bring in the new capital, it's going to match whatever the mix of workers that you want. And so it's really the depreciation rate in the way. Now, on the good side, one parameter does all of our transition dynamics, which is tractable. It's easy to discipline. In terms of the real world, you could imagine the adjustment process is probably much more complex than a one parameter model, but this is going to give you a flavor of how we could get the short run and the long run in a very
You don't
parsimonious
throw
way.
away your old capital and build. You wait for it to depreciate.
Yeah, or you could shut it down. So they always have the option to shut it down.
I'm sorry, we have questions.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
The minimum wage started out about 0.6% of manufacturing. It's been discounted. How do you adjust for these parameters that were fixed initially and were discounted? Are you going to bring it back to the old established minimum wage?
Let's get to the quantification. Well, let's talk a little bit about now. Let's talk about the general model without a minimum wage right now, just to try to see the economic forces, and then we'll come back when we talk about quantification. The model is going to be real everywhere, and so this kind of goes back to some of the questions we got earlier. So we're going to have a real shock in the minimum wage when it goes up because there's only real, but then I'm going to allow for a temporary shock in the minimum wage, which happens if the nominal minimum wage goes up and then it erodes over time because of inflation. I'm going to show you all of those pictures, but I want to get the model out there before we get to the policy evaluation stuff. Yeah, Adrien.
So the Leontief, you could do it multiple ways because the basic model is CES in the capital and the bundle, and then the Leontief, you could be capital and every single one.
We have 2M labor factors, 2M of one group, M of the other group, and one kind of capital. It's Leontief across the 2M plus one factors. Jointly.
For every single one of them.
Exactly. So capital
Literally a machine for one worker.
Exactly. Yeah. Think about a grill is good for some types of workers, and then computer is good for another type within the thing. So that's exactly what it is.
You could do something a little bit more like within for
you could do
with
1,000 things differently,
Sure.
but that's not what we did.
Yeah, but 1 second. We didn't want additional parameters, Adrien. So we wanted this notion
still
of.
be one parameter.
Let me just kind of give a big picture to both of their. Thank you both. But what it is what we really need is this putty clay does is it gives us adjustment cost to both capital and labor simultaneously in a kind of joint way. I could put in adjustment cost to capital in a complex way. I could put in adjustment cost to labor in a complex way. I don't know how I would discipline them, this is a way, but the key thing is we need adjustment costs to both capital and labor, and this is kind of a way to get adjustment costs to both capital and labor in a parsimonious way.
So Eric has an example in the paper where if you have labor aggregates, but you have within the labor aggregate, it's perfectly fine and it's only the average, you adjust like that. And it completely inconsistent with the data.
So that's what it is. It's
Because
really,
you just shift
I'll
this
go even
from
further. I
cost.
think
Here,
I've come
if
to the
it's-
conclusion
if
that it's
that, you
adjustment
can't.
cost on labor. That is really the important thing that we kind of knew in a way that's kind of related to kind of the structure of the firm. And that's kind of the key thing. And this kind of gives us that in a parsimonious way. So let me give you the last part of the model on the table. I'm going to then apologize for a couple of things that aren't in the model, and then we'll get to the results. And so here's our household preferences, and this is where the monopsony is going to come in. So you're going to give me a couple of seconds to see how I'm going to embed a monopsony into our model. So we're going to have individuals who are going to have, for each of those families' eyes, they're going to have preferences over their consumption. They're going to have some disutility over working, and then there's going to be some search back in the background. I'll talk about that in a second. People are going to have to find some jobs. That's also a way to close the model when there's rationing with the minimum wage. Ignore that part for now. So what is this disutility of what?
Wait, when I see GHH, I think this is the last scoundrel of somebody who doesn't want any income effects on labor supply. Even
Or
though
laziness. You got to give me laziness. It's just tractability and laziness is another thing. So we have no income effects on labor supply.
And that is important, or it's just tractable?
Tractable is what we're doing. I don't know. On our list of things to think about is relaxing this part of the component. It just makes it tractable. I mean, you have a large family that's relatively insured. So the question is, how we're going to discipline the income effects on labor supply. I'm going to tell you, I could play around with our labor supply parameter. It is nowhere near as important as the firm substitutability. Once I get to the quantification, you'll see where some of this, this
Large family is not a fact.
It's not a fact. It's a tractable way.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a tractable way. Exactly.
GHH also gives you this complementarity between labor and consumption. So that could matter for the dynamics.
Yeah. So the question is,
It's not just the discussioning of the income effect.
but I think it's going to matter in a quantitative sense and not a qualitative. And when we get to the thing, I'm going to show you some numbers, but I really want to see the qualitative patterns that really I think are going to help us interpret the data from the empiricists that they give us. Now, if I wanted to do a full quantitative, and you take my number of what is the optimal minimum wage or the optimal EITC, thinking about these kind of forces is going to be important. That's not what my game I want to play. I want to play a game of what is the mechanisms that we need to think about in a framework sense to kind of help interpret a lot of the empirical literature that is coming to us. So, and let me show you a little bit, and then we could come back at the end and say, oh, here's all these things we might want to do. And then we could talk about whether that's going to change the takeaways that I want to do from the paper. It certainly will matter quantitatively. I just don't think qualitatively for the points I'm trying to make, it's going to be that. Let me tell you now, I think this is something substantive.
You mentioned it in the last bullet.
A lot more bullets coming.
So-
So
You know, like so many labor economists, you really don't take unemployment seriously.
no, I do.
Unemployment is the domain of. the
You're saying things that are
macroeconomics.
not true. Because right now, the whole model has a search component in the background. I'm not going to highlight this for, again, the points I'm making, but we have an unemployment versus out of labor force margin. And that's where the search is coming in the background. I'm not going to talk about that today because it's irrelevant to the points I want to make.
But your idea is there's some determination of employment. And then there's a residual, which someone else can take care of. That
No, we're taking care of it. I'm just not going to talk to you about it today.
What makes you say that?
But no, I'm
Just search, work, and stay at home.
Everybody else close your eyes for 1 second. I hate doing this. Bob,
can
I'm
make
going to
a
go, and
report.
then in a little while, there's going to be a directed search framework in the background. We're going to have a whole bunch of things. Okay, everybody else open your eyes. We're back to this part. So let me talk to you now about the monopsony part of the model, because that's the last, again, important component in trying to think about the forces that I want to highlight today. So I'm going to have preferences embedded in the model that are going to generate monopsony power. Let me give you the intuition and the metaphor of what we're doing, and I'm going to tell you why this functional form is a good metaphor for what we're trying to do. So the background concept, think about there, is workers are going to have idiosyncratic preferences for the different types of workplaces that are out there. Each of these workplaces are ex ante homogeneous, except have the same production functions, everything, except one's green and one's blue. John might like working at green firms, not like working at blue firms. Maybe the green firm's close to his house and the blue firm's farther away. I might like working at blue firms and not green firms. So we have these preferences for these jobs. As the green firm starts to expand, they're going to basically hire John, but in order for them to hire me in, they got to compensate me for the disutility of coming into that firm. And so that means as the more the firm hires, the marginal cost of hiring workers is going to increase as they're bringing in people with less and less good fit for those jobs. So that's kind of what we're trying.
And there's
to do.
horizontal equity in pay.
And so firms, they can't price discriminate.
Okay.
So when they see a type, they can only see your I-ness, not your preference
Okay.
draws in the background. And so they have to pay everybody the same afterwards. And so this preference structure I'm going to do is exactly analogous to Stiglitz in the goods market in terms of a love of variety sense, which generates monopolistic competition in the product market. I'm going to use the same thing on the worker side in terms of preferences for jobs that's going to generate monopsony power among the firms. And so this parameter omega is then going to generate, from the worker's perspective, how substitutable those jobs are with each other. And if that parameter goes to infinity, then there's no monopsony power. All the jobs are roughly the same. If omega is going to be
this part of the model, I have a hard time wrapping my head around. For one, the first thing that comes to my mind is in city. If you live in a city, you got all kinds of jobs to choose from. So this effect seems like it's a lot less important than if you live in a rural area, where if you're 50 miles from the blue company and you really like the blue company, you got to work for the green company because you're so far away.
So Steve is saying there's heterogeneity out there in dimensions, which the model does not have. We have a national market, and we are going to use national aggregates from people who try to estimate the extent of wage markdowns as our discipline. And then here's the key thing, Lucy. If you don't want any monopsony power, if you believe there's no monopsony power in the rural or high in the rural, we could just change our parameter. And then I'm going to show you a whole vector of parameters, and then we could see how the model evolves. Again, it's a framework paper allowing us to, do these types of policies. And if you want a different parameter, we could just put a different parameter.
Oh, but yeah, I don't know how, are you going to make strong welfare claims?
I'm going to show you qualitative welfare claims of how things change over different horizons.
Just back to the equation a second.
Yeah.
So every worker works a little bit of every job. Is that what I and J is?
Yeah, so every worker is a large family, and you're aggregating over your family. So this is, in a literal sense, there's lots of I's, and we all care. We're all pooling our I-ness together, and you go to the green firm, I go to the blue firm.
So I is a family, J is a worker within the family.
The I is a family, and a worker in a family, and J is a firm. So J is green firm versus blue firms.
So IJT is what fraction of your family works at
Firm, the green firms versus the blue firms.
Yeah. The family's a measure one cut up into people measures for kids.
And so the literature, again, in the aggregate data, there's a whole bunch of burgeoning literature on wage markdowns with a variety of different estimating strategies that have come out in the last 4 or 5 years. Magne Monstag has some stuff going to this. Steve's student Claudia has some estimates on this. Some of our current and former colleagues, David Berger and Simon Mangi and Kyle Herkenoff have some estimates. They're all in this range of 0.65 to 0.85. I'm going to take 0.75 as kind of my baseline, and then I'm going to show you a whole bunch of other things.
Back to the previous point, at least some of that work has got lots of spatial heterogeneity in the markdowns they estimate, right?
So we think of it, can I say,
you go.
we think of it also in terms of other dimensions of horizontal differentiation, like amenities and match quality as reflected in non-pecuniary value of work.
Yeah, I'm not averse to the basic idea. It's just that the scope for those to matter seems to vary a lot in the spatial cross-section. Maybe I'm thinking about it wrong.
So let me show you what I'm going to do. And then at the end, let's come back and say, I would like more of this or less of that. Once I tell you kind of what I'm doing with the model that I've kind of given you a roadmap. You haven't kind of seen the thing.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, you might say, I think this whole thing is flawed because you don't have this kind of regional variation. And I'll say, okay, then maybe we need to think about it. But I think we're going to get pretty far with what I am going to do, that then we could talk about how we're going to, on the edges.
What you're going to do is a 25% markdown.
And one of mine, and then I'm going to show you a 10%, and I'm going to show you a 30%.
just wanna-
Yeah, our baseline is going to be 25%.
You said 75, but you didn't say whether.
Oh, yeah, so I should be clear. It's
The
a,
numbers one
so
minus
point, yeah, so it's basically a 25% markdown or a 15% markdown or a 35% markdown. So, but our baseline
I
is
get to choose.
25% below marginal product is our baseline in terms of our calibration
Based on,
baseline.
but then
I'm going to show you a
I
lot of
like that
different
idea.
ranges.
you'll serve me, the very next thing you'll do is serve me 15.
Yes, I'll show you some pictures with this.
35.
Yes, I'll show you those pictures. Okay, because really, I want to show the framework and how these parameters move things around. And so I'm going to show you, I'm going to move lots of things around because I really want to get the economic mechanism of where these trade-offs, why these dynamics can be big or small. And I'm going to show you that.
Toward with the idea that power being a function of your time horizon, right? I mean,
Yes,
Interesting.
I have not played with it. That's a good question. I mean, there's no timing dimension in this part of the model. All the time is on the firm side. I don't have any time on the preference side, and that could be interesting to think about. I just don't have any way to think about disciplining that yet. But if I did, that would be that's a limitation because all of my time is on the firm, not on the house. Okay.
You
So-
say I? Are you specifically in charge of this within the team?
We, I should be saying. Bob has made it clear.
No, I just wondered.
It is we. We are a team. It's not just an I. But Bob was making fun of me because I was ignoring my co-authors.
I'm trying to find that.
You should sit a little closer to the.
So it is a we. It is a we. Okay. So let me just now say two more. I was gonna do one more thing, and then I want to get to some results. But just to make sure. So what is this going to do? So the monopsony power, as we start going forward, there's going to be a directed search part of the model that I'm not even going to talk about. But the way I want to think about it is we've already, it's in the paper. You could read the paper if you want more details. I should say that. So the margin.
What makes you choose? I mean, that's also, that's another one of these theoretical constructions, which is very, very distant from empirical findings.
So-
Directed search. Is there something about directed search as opposed to random search that?
None of it matters quantitatively for what we're going to talk about today. And so why do we do it? I want something, again, for those who are interested, there's a search part of the model in the background. It's just a way to close the model when there's rationing with a minimum wage, who gets allocated to which jobs.
That's a labor economist talking.
But I'm part of that. But there's quantitatively, it's not going to be so. There's going to be lots of things around there. I've chosen a talk that's going to show you the ones that at least quantitatively are going to be the more important of the mechanisms I'm going to show you today. And then there's other things, some of which I've included in the model that we could talk about after, and some of the things I didn't, which I'll apologize about in a few slides. And so I think, let me get a little further, and I think some of this feedback will be even better as we get a little further. But the key thing that I want to show why is the monopsony going to be important in this model is for the exact reason that Steve kind of highlighted already, is that when you want to hire more workers, you got to pay all your old workers of the same type the same wage. And so that means you're going to have these upward sloping marginal cost curves that are going to be rising even faster than the average cost curve because you got to pay all these workers.
We can all see worker types.
And we can see a worker eye is observable to everybody. It's stamped on your head. And so with this monopsony power, just in a classic undergraduate textbook sense, that's going to cause firms to pay lower wages relative to marginal product and hire less workers than they would in a competitive model. And so let me just kind of give you the textbookness of this in a stripped down model. This isn't exactly our model because there's no worker heterogeneity, there's no search or anything, but this is what you would get in an undergraduate textbook scenario with an upward sloping average cost curve for labor from the monopsony power. The competitive equilibrium is going to be those WC and WN, the competitive equilibrium, the C for competitive. The firms are going to price on their marginal cost curve, which is going to be lower wages and lower employment at the same time. Now, why is that important? Now we're getting to the nonlinear part of the model. If I start doing positive, like minimum wages in the model, forcing you to pay a little bit more, for a little while, you're going to get higher wages and higher employment. But if the minimum wage keeps going up, if you start forcing people to pay higher than WC, firms are going to do what any neoclassical firm was going to do. They're just going to hire less of those workers. So you're going to have this very non-monotonic response to policy because of the monopsony power. And so that's going to be in the background of a lot of what we're going to talk about today. This non-monotonicity is going to be important at different horizons even. Okay. Talk about that. Here's my apology slide. There's a lot of other things. The regional one I should have added to this. This is all national coming through. I'm not going to have endogenous firm entry in this model. We could talk about how that might change as well, even though the policies are going to start playing around with firm profits. And I'll show you how that's going to happen. That might be something we might want to consider. I'm not going to have workers are going to be born with their Zs and their skills, their education groups. I'm not going to allow for any upgrading. Maybe that's important. The model is going to be completely real. So there's no real, price response, but importantly, there's not even heterogeneous response. Different groups might consume different goods, and different goods might be bound by the minimum wage. I have none of that in there. We could talk about qualitatively how that might change our results a little bit later on, but I just wanted to get it up. These are all questions that usually come up, and I'm going to say I have nothing to say about those today, except some speculations, I think. Yeah.
This question, you're ready for this question. The monopsony power of the employer generates a lot of profit. But what do you do to since profit doesn't exist in our normal thinking? What do you do about how do you dissipate the profit?
So the profits go to the workers based upon their share of labor income, and so low wage workers are not getting any of those profits because they get very little of the labor income. The high wage workers are getting most of the profit because they make most of the income. So we keep the profit share in the model similar to the income share of the total income wage bill.
What do you mean they go to?
So the workers own the firms are earning profits. Those profits then dissipated back to the workers in their budget constraint, and the share they get rebated back is going to be to the share of their profits for laboring. Okay?
I mean, all of this machinery, this is what drives any benefit from any minimum wage, right? Like if it wasn't the case that there was monopsony power, and it wasn't the case that the rents accrued from that didn't get got unevenly distributed, then minimum wages would always be bad.
So we're trying to give minimum wage a chance to do something, and then we're going to try to learn, and then it's going to how much it does. We could take the monopsony power to zero. I mean, right. We make it perfectly competitive in the labor market, and that will always be bad. Dan's already forecast. You could already see, and I'm going to show you some of that as we do some of the markdowns go close to zero.
So the way to look at these welfare results are assuming that there is monopsony power. Then
everything is dependent upon the parameters of the model, and we can change those parameters in any way we want.
I understand. Okay.
Okay, so that's kind of the framework. So let me just summarize the key parts of this framework that we're going to go, going forward, and how I'm going to discipline those key parts. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there, but I think those are not going to be where the big value added is, or at least quantitatively, those other mechanisms for what we want to show you. So there's going to be the monopsony power. We can make that anything we want. We're going to target the wage markdowns in the literature, but then we're also going as a baseline of a 25% markdown. People are paid 25 less than their marginal product as our baseline. But we could take that, people are paid their marginal product. We could then take it, people are paid 35% less than their marginal product. So we could play with that parameter, and I'm going to show you different results, but in our baseline, I'm just going to target the average of this range. The labor substitutability, just give me 1 second, Chris. I'm just going to take right from the lower bound of Card and Lemieux, and I'm going to show you lots of robustness. What happens if that number is a little higher or lower? We're going to match the types of the Mews, as we talked about earlier on, just to match the wage distribution in the data, and then the depreciation rate, which determines the one parameter that determines all the timing. We're just going to set that to 15% in our background. So we could play with any of these, but these are the 4 things that are going to determine the quantitative patterns I'm going to show you coming upwards. First, Chris, and then I'll come back.
Clarification: when you change the monopsony power parameter, do you re-estimate?
Yes, everything's estimated jointly. I should have been saying these are kind of targeted stuff, but everything's estimated jointly. Jack, and then I'll come back to
15%, like that seems high to me. So is it that you think
structures are probably not putty clay and equipment is, and equipment's more.
So we've gone back between 10% and 15% all the time. One is in the appendix, one is in the paper. We're doing, again, trying to, because people have pushed back, maybe the structures isn't going to be the key component of the relative to the adjustment relative. We went a little bit lower, but we want to show robustness to all of these. Again, it's a framework setting. And we're using this as a baseline, but the other one, the 10%, is how we had everything until about 2 weeks ago. And then we got comments the other way. Maybe we should exclude the structure part and go to the 15%. Yeah.
You're assuming employee-owned firms for the model?
Yeah. So the profits then go back to
but obviously there are distributional effects if it's not employee-owned firms.
Yeah. I mean, for the workers,
that's the big argument in the monopsony area.
Yeah. So the key part is, at least for these policies, targeting the low end of the distribution, they essentially, in our model, essentially own none of the profit anyways. They're just epsilon. So whether we make that 0 or epsilon, it doesn't change any of the results in the paper. Now, if all the poor people owned all the firms, that would be something, but that's counterintuitive in the data, AJ.
So you haven't talked much about the labor supply decision, but for the ITC, it's all about kind of marginal tax rates.
That's coming in 20 minutes.
But there is the labor supply.
Or maybe we won't get to it.
No, but we have a Frisch of 1 in the background. We show you what happens when a Frisch of 2 or Frisch of 0.5, and those quantitatively don't change any of kind of our results. And they do, again, it moves things, but epsilon relative to these other parameters.
The US tax code in the background.
Yes. Yeah. So let me show you some of those as we get to those. Let me kind of then, here's my roadmap of what we're going to do in the last half hour now. I'm going to start with the minimum wage. Everything's going to be a permanent change in the real minimum wage to start. We'll do temporary stuff at the end. I'm going to show you long run results. I'm going to show you short run results. I'm going to show you some transition paths, all for the minimum wage. And then I'm going to show you what happens when we go to the EITC. I'll have to introduce the EITC. I'll show you how we could compare the EITC policy to the minimum wage. But the key part is I want to highlight between these two policies, the transition dynamics are very different. And when we start integrating over periods of time, projecting from the short run, it really matters whether you're doing the minimum wage or the EITC, because the patterns are not only, quantitative, they're just qualitatively different. And I'll show you that when we get there. So that's kind of the structure of what's to come. So let's start now. God comes down. We start with the steady state of the world in a current $7.25 national minimum wage in the model, which is essentially binding on nobody. And then we drop a minimum wage unexpectedly on this market. And we're going to drop small minimum wages, medium minimum wages, large minimum wages unexpectedly on top of this market, and then see what happens to the employment, the earnings, and the welfare of all the different types of workers in the model. And again, I'm just going to focus on the low educated workers in what I'm going to show you today, because the high educated aren't doing much. Okay, so this is the first set of effects. So I'm going to go through these a little bit slowly. It's the non-monotonicity that we were talking about at the beginning. Each one of those lines is a different type of worker. So the blue line that's one all the way off to the left is going to be a worker who was initially pre-minimum wage making $7.50. So like the bottom of the wage distribution. The purple line is a worker making initially $10 an hour, and the red line is going to be a worker making $13 an hour. So these are three different types of eyes that we're looking at. The minimum wage comes in, and the x-axis is the size of the minimum wage. So basically up to $7.25, there was no minimum wage. That was the initial steady state. And then the minimum wage starts rising. And you can see that first worker, let's work on the left panel for employment. That first worker, that $7.50 worker, their efficient wage, they're making a markdown of 25%. So their efficient wage is something like $9.50 or something. So as the minimum wage rises to like $9.50, they are starting to work more. The monopsony power is declining. The firms are optimally choosing to hire more of these workers because they're still making some profits. And then eventually, as the minimum wage gets above $9.50, the firms say, hey, wait a second, I'm starting to lose money on this worker, and the firm's going to start switching away from them. And so that's where you're going to start getting this hump-shaped pattern. And then again, there's a different level of the optimal minimum wage for different workers. So the peak of the worker initially making $10 an hour is something like 13. And so the first thing you want to think about is the peak of these Laffer curve. I call them a Laffer curve. They're basically just a non-monotonic hump-shaped profile in the minimum wage in terms of employment, depends upon the worker's type. And that means that the single minimum wage is just a very blunt policy tool to deal with monopsony distortions in this model where monopsony is constant across workers. When you start fixing the monopsony for the low wage worker, you're having no effect on the higher wage worker. If you start going to the higher wage worker, you're starting to basically kill the lower wage workers in the long run. I'm not going to talk a lot about numbers in the paper, but if you look at the x-axis or the y-axis and you go to the right picture, that's labor income. The peak of the labor income is just higher than the peak of the employment. Why? Because they're getting the minimum wage effect directly. So their wage is going up and their employment's going up. So these workers really get better off, and then you start switching away. Steve?
Some of the studies in the literature exploit national minimum wage changes and the heterogeneity across localities and how much it bites. You would expect, if your model is kind of basically on the right track, that you'd see evidence of these
in the long run. If we went out to the long run, we would.
Yeah. So, well, is there any hint of this kind of thing in the literature already?
Yes, because we match the short run exactly. And when I show you the short run picture,
No, I mean, I'm talking about the evidence of the non-monotonicity.
then the non-monotonicity is the long run.
I know. But so you want to look at a period where the wage changed and nothing else happened for a couple of years or so.
20.
You need 20. I mean, I'm going to tell you.
20.
I mean, these are. I'll show you all the time dynamics.
It's going to come out.
Exactly.
Okay.
I'll show you all that in the. I'm going to show you Steve's picture to match the literature when I get to the short run and the transition dynamics, because that's where the literature really comes into these 2-year, 3-year, 5
And
years.
in the short run, some of these guys in Mississippi, if the national minimum wage goes up, they're already on the downward sloping part, aren't they?
I wouldn't say the
No,
evidence
no,
is that the people whose productivity is $2 an hour are not employed. They're out. They're
Yes, right.
Let me give.
Shouldn't lose sight of that kind of
put this
evidence. too,
together
right.
in an order that I think we're going to get to that soon. Let me just kind of do a couple more things, and then we're going to come and I want to talk about the literature, and I'm going to show you focus in on where the period of time when the literature estimates, and I'll show you where that is in our transition dynamics.
But Steve, Mir and others have found out that 3 to 5 to 7 years rate employment difference change in sign and size.
Yeah.
So it switches from positive to negative.
So one quick question on this, following up on Steve. So many of these people are going to be on other government programs. So how are you netting all that out?
Yeah.
Vast array. Many people are on 3, 4, 5.
So in this
programs.
part, I'm just doing the minimum wage, holding everything else with no other policy. Then when we put the two together, I'm going to have a tax and transfer system that looks like the US, and then I'll put minimum wage, and you'll see there's some interactions. I might not show you much of that today, but in the paper we do a lot. But right now, think about the minimum wage just to get the fundamentals of the mechanisms, and then we'll try to put them together with a tax and
I
transfer
think where
system.
this comment comes in is that people's labor supply elasticities are different.
Yeah.
If your alternative is social programs with 100% marginal tax rate, that gives you a very different labor supply elasticity than our alternative, which is just leisure.
So what's the tax code here?
None.
This
On
is
this
the
part?
pure.
No
Then
tax,
we-
no
This
service.
is pure.
So then,
This is just no government, they all of a sudden put
Oh.
a minimum wage.
Yep.
And we had a thing in the appendix where we put it on top of that.
Minimum wage, ATC,
But
and
this
then
is the
all of
pure
it
effect.
together.
Because another fact here is the very low labor supply, low labor force participation of low income people compared to very high income people, which I think.
yeah, we match that. Those are targets that we're going to be matching
We are
as we
gonna
go
match
through. Yep, exactly. So we're matching the employment rates and the in the wage distribution in our initial equilibrium. So, okay. So this is now, instead of worker by worker, this is going to be all of non-college workers together. And again, going back, here's the non-monotonicity, that if we're going to look at non-college employment, not the $750 person or the $15 person, put them all together, you see that hump-shaped pattern that we were talking about early on. Small minimum wage changes could actually have a positive effect. The larger you get the minimum wage, the more negative the total effect will be on this group. And then the labor income peaks a little later. Why? Because even those who aren't working, those who are working are getting the big wage increase. So there's a direct effect of the minimum wage in increasing earnings for those who are working. So the peak is higher and a little bit later than it would be with the employment. Okay, we already talked about that. So here is now, suppose we put an $8.50 cent minimum wage. So we're starting with $7.25. We just increased the minimum wage by $1.25. What happens to different types of workers with this policy? And in this policy, the lowest paid workers, like $7.50, that's where the minimum wage is currently binding, or some low wage worker, and $8.50, all it does is reduce the monopsony distortion, and you get positive effects on net, even in the long run, by reducing the monopsony distortion in this model. They're not huge.
Does Stigler get, does anyone remember Stigler's famous paper on this?
Why don't you tell me a little bit?
But just, I give it, it's an exact replica of what you just said.
Okay, perfect. But the key is then when we start doing policy, let me show you what happens to a $15 minimum wage in the long run, which is well outside of those bands. And so now we put a national $15 minimum wage on. And what is happening is you're killing the bottom part of the distribution. And so by a huge amount, it's basically firms are substituting away from these workers. If you take those cardinal mu estimates seriously, you take which is really the key part here, that is saying that when those workers making $7.25, you have to pay them $15, the firms are going to say, I don't need any of those because their marginal product is just so low. And you can see that in employment is just plummeting for these workers in the right panel. The middle is labor income. Even labor income in the long run is plummeting for these workers because no one wants to hire them. Those who do get hired are making more, but that's relatively small. And then the last part is welfare. What's the difference between income and welfare? There's going to be some disutility of labor supply in the background. So if I force you to work, you don't like that as much. And so that's where the labor supply elasticity quantitatively is making the difference between the middle picture and the end picture.
Do I remember correctly that you have a little on 100 diagram of why there's the Stigler effect disappears at a certain point, is taken by the anti.
Yeah, so that was kind of the reduced form of stuff I showed you in the textbook case, the Econ 1 case, is eventually you're going to hit the monopsony power, and then whatever that monopsony is, once you extract that, you're not going to get any of the benefits anymore, and then you're only going to get the neoclassical effects in the long run. And that's kind of, here is all just the neoclassical effects. Firms are just substituting away by the cardinal mu estimate of the labor substitutability.
You didn't emphasize that. Seems like
should have. That's what I really wanted. Those are the old. I should have. Maybe go back. Maybe I should have done this one more time because maybe I didn't say it. And Patrick's getting mad because when I go backwards. But let me just kind of say these hump shapes. To be clear, the upward sloping part of the hump shape is the monopsony power. So that's omega. The downward sloping part of these profiles is the cardinal mu labor substitutability, the phi. So the upside is omega, the downside is the phi, and those are the two parameters. So if the omega was basically no wage markdown, you'd only get the down. That was Dan's part early on. If you had less labor substitutability, that down slope is going to be a lot flatter. And that's what I'm going to show you next. And so to Bob's point, I promised the paper has lots of pictures like this. I'm going to show you one. That middle box is kind of our baseline parameterization, cardinal mu substitutability of 4, the wage markdown of 25%. That's basically saying to a $15 minimum wage, the non-college labor group on average would be in the long run declining employment by about 12%. If you basically go to the right to make the markdown even smaller, those numbers get bigger. So the more, this is Dan's comment, if you take monopsony, I didn't take it all the way to 0, but I'm taking it close to 0. And what you're getting there is only the negative effects.
now, on the top line, equal 2, you get 0.75 and 0.9. The Stigler effect disappears completely at a markdown of years.
So markdown of 40% and no labor substitutability, it means even a $15 minimum wage in the long run has essentially no negative effect to non-college workers as a whole. There might be some in the distribution sense that are made worse off, the bottom part, but as a whole, this is what I want to say, the parameters that matter, the Stigler effect. If the substitutability is really low and the markdowns are huge, you could even handle more higher minimum wages. Now, you can't go to $100 an hour, but in this calibration, you can go to $15 an hour if the markdown was large enough and the substitutability was small enough, and you'd have no negative effects in the long run.
I was asking about the other end, where there's no Stigler effect because there's no markdown.
Okay, so going over here, and so here,
But the
So what's the
6.3
question?
the
If you
question
go
is-
that way, they just get killed.
The question is, why is it 6.3 and 6.4? There's almost no difference between 0.75 and 0.9, even though that number must go to 0 if it's 1.0. Plus I'm missing something.
I have to go back and see what is the quantification, why those numbers don't change. But the key part is if there's no substitutability, it doesn't matter. Suppose we're in a world where I needed all John productivities. John is like, I of type something that gave him 750 in the world. If I had a production function where I needed John in that production, it doesn't matter what I have to pay him.
If you go Leontief, you keep going flat until you shut the whole thing
Until
down.
you shut the whole thing down. There's going to be some point we're going to
That's it.
shut down.
So make B go to 0, you go Leontief until you say it's not worth operating this firm, you
Yeah, then
just
you just
shut
shut
it down. So it'd be 0, 0, 0 till it went to like 35 in our model, then the economy would shut down.
All right,
Is the monopsony there?
Anyway, let's keep going. That's not a big deal, what you're talking about.
Is the monopsony there to explain a fact in the data or just to make the minimum wage do something
If
good?
you want to give them the minimum wage a chance to do something good. Now, it's also matched. The data says people are estimating something that it could be there. But in the model, it's a way to make give the minimum wage or any policy a fighting chance to have positive welfare effects.
Since 1923, Joan Robinson argued that's why you should have a minimum wage. Every single pro-minimum wage
fine.
paper has monopsony. We wanted to be balanced and say,
That's my
good
question.
and bad.
He just
It's not,
clarified.
it's not a set of facts.
I'm
that
just telling you.
You were trying to match.
Yeah.
It's a set of facts that other people.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to know.
Okay, so let's go now to the short run, because I want to do a few more things before in the last 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do now is kind of give you the whole transition dynamics. And so this kind of goes to Steve's question. The lines on the left, let's start there, are employment. The line on the right are going to be labor income. And I have 3 lines there, and those are for different sized minimum wage changes. So this is all non-college workers we're looking at now pooled together. I'll show you different types of workers in the next slides. And the black line is what happens if we put a $15 minimum wage. The red line is what happens when we put I think I'm going to use a $10 minimum wage. And I think the blue line is going to be the $8.50 minimum wage. And so let's start with the top 2 lines. And you can see from those top 2 lines that the short run and the long run kind of look the same in the sense that they are so small, the minimum wage, that it reduces the markdown. It creates a little bit of a positive effect on workers, even in the short run, small. And then over time, firms don't want to substitute away from those workers. They're still making profits on those workers. So the long run effects and the short run effects are relatively identical. Now, and if anything, the short run effects are small relative to the long run effects because the workers might reallocate some of their production towards those workers because they're hiring more of those workers in the long run. And so you get a little extra kick. That extra kick is quantitatively small. But the key thing is, if we have small minimum wage changes, the short run response is not a bad approximation for the long run response. However, with a large minimum wage change, the short run response is a little negative. But the longer you go over time, firms are going to start substituting more and more away from that. And then the short run response is going to be completely uninformative about the eventual long run response. The shaded area is where, I don't know if you guys had David Newmark out recently, but David Newmark has a paper summarizing like 100 papers, mostly all from the regional stuff, as Steve said, which basically had a range of estimates from the literature and all of this literature was about 2 years out. Now, there's some papers now that do a little bit longer than 2 years, but the bulk of the literature looks 2 years post a minimum wage change. That's going to be that shaded thing. You could have a small minimum wage change, a medium minimum wage change, or even a very large minimum wage change, and they're all in the same kind of ballpark of relatively small estimates in the short run. And so this is my answer to Steve's early on. The longer you go out, though, you should start seeing more differences between these policies. And some papers have done longer time horizons for smaller changes. I don't have a pointer, but for smaller changes, again, the medium run and the long run and the short run are roughly the same. Yeah.
What's the evidentiary foundation that led you to structure your model in such a way that long run substitution from low skilled labor to capital is really small?
Oh, so we took 3 estimates. We did Cobb Douglas as the baseline, but others we've tried to put an elasticity of substitution of 2 instead of 1, and we did it
Do you
at
have any direct evidence on this?
People have estimated. Juan Carlos left. but Juan Carlos has a paper on trying to estimate that. Says it's not too crazy different from Cobb Douglas. Corv has a different kind of structure. Yeah, and so we've tried to play around with some of those. We tried to hardwire. We thought that when we originally wrote the paper, we thought that's where the biggest kick was going to be.
Yeah, that seemed like a
And we
plausible
couldn't get
place
that
to look.
quantitatively. It was all the labor substitutability was much more quantitatively important, at least given because the Cardinal and the Mu are estimating things like 4 to 6. The people doing the capital substitutes sometimes get 1.2 or 1.3, and so they're just quantitatively small relative to this.
So what's building over time if the capital labor substitution
Well-
isn't, what's building so much over time in the dotted line on the left?
Oh, so what it is, it's the production plans. The capital is changing, but it's changing for Pete worker versus Patrick worker.
So it is the capital labor substitution, but
Is it-
interacted
but-
with the high five.
With the and the worker type.
Different than the
The
usual.
type,
sort.
Yeah.
it's a different, it's a different.
Yeah.
Yes.
A lot of the experiments, including some at the Minneapolis Fed, look at hours effects.
Yeah.
Do you ever get at that?
We don't have no hours
You
margin.
could watch the time.
Yeah, I'm almost done. Okay, let me, boom, boom. This is all the things I said in words. Let me kind of show you now 2 types of workers, the transition path. So on the left is going to be a small minimum wage change. And the 2 lines are initial worker making $7.50 an hour. And the red line is going to be a worker making $12 an hour. When you put an $8.50 minimum wage on this, it hardly has any effect on the worker who's making $12 an hour. That's what the red line is, $12 an hour. The worker making $7 to $50 gets a little better off. Like when you give them a 15% minimum wage, their wage increases by about 15%. And then as firms start adjusting their capital towards that worker because they're hiring more of that worker, they get a little extra kick going forward. Whereas the large minimum wage change, and this is the key part here, for a large minimum wage change, take a look at that $7.50 worker. They earn huge amounts of gains in the short run. Why? Because firms aren't substituting away from them, and their minimum wage doubled. They were earning $7.50, and now they're being paid $15. So they get a 100% increase in their labor earnings in the short run. But over time, firms start substituting away from them. So when we do if we want to evaluate this policy, you got to integrate over the short run gains and the long run costs. And those could be very different from each other for big minimum wage changes for certain types of workers. Now notice the $12 worker, when you go to 15, you're actually getting closer to their efficient level. And so they get a jump in the short run, and then they get even more of a gain in the long run as firms start switching towards them.
What's the main reason that there's this lagged adjustment of retirement?
Firms slowly adjust their capital stock. So the putty clay nature. So think about it as a way they have this capital there. It's already installed, so they can make a choice to either use it or shut it down. And then they're buying new capital over time, and they're going to buy new capital to fit whatever the production mix of the workers they want. And so Elena uses a certain type of capital as a low-skilled worker. I use a different type of capital as a higher-skilled worker. And as things start changing over time, we're going to start making the capital. If I hire more of Elena, I'm going to have more machines that go with Elena, and that increases their marginal product a little over time.
This is really weird, though. Sorry, go ahead, Bob.
You said a little.
I'm just saying, in this example, if she was the $12 worker, it would be a little on the right-hand side when we go to $15
But if
minimum
it
wage.
was $35 an hour, you would do it instantaneously.
It's weird is the government goes and makes Elena more expensive. And your reaction is, well, I'll buy more capital that's specific to Elena. Now, I understand what's
No,
doing
you
it.
figure you're substituting away from the ones that became more expensive. You're only substituting Elena when she is still profitable to you.
Right.
So Elena is still profitable. You made Elena a little bit more expensive, but she's still profitable to you. But all the other people below Elena, you've slipped away from, and so now you're switching to all other workers.
Remember the static monopsony. As long as for you specifically, you're below your peak, you're less than loosely 25% over what you're making. You want to go up because you wiped out your monopsony power. And when you hit the peak, then you go straight competitive logic down.
So let's take John's question with the right-hand picture. You can see they're substituting away from that $750 worker.
Because you're over the peak.
You're over the peak. And now they're substituting towards all other workers, and one of those is going to be towards Elena. And so you're making some capital to go with it. Even though she's a little more expensive, you're still going to willing to use her as opposed to the people you're switching away from completely. So you're just basically killing the bottom of the distribution, moving up the distribution. And now, if we went to too high of a wage, you'd start switching away from Elena as
You
well.
see it overnight.
Yeah.
But this turns very much on this very high adjustment cost of capital.
But there's no cost.
I mean, the way we model, it's
No
a
cost?
putty clay structure. It is.
You just can't do it.
It's the way we've.
Sorry,
I mean,
sorry.
you don't burn up real resources.
Infinite cost.
Like we've done a lot of the minimum.
But the
wage
key
stuff.
thing is, so
You
there's
don't
two
burn up
parts of this. There's
whatever.
on impact, which allows us to match the data from the minimum wage, which is basically, no matter what you do in the minimum wage in the short run, people are getting relatively small response on impact. And so we needed some mechanism to match that. And then we have this long run adjustment that other people have estimated. And so we anchor that. Now, how you get from the long run to the short run, how long that time is, we have a specific structure to do that, but that won't change the short run effect. There's no effect going on. The long run effect seems to be going on. And then we've just had the putty clay structure to get us from the short run to long run. So you might say, maybe we could get to the long run quicker. Well, then we'll just play with the depreciation rate. Or you get to the long run slower, we could just play with the depreciation rate. But the key thing is the short run, nothing's happening because firms can't adjust their production mix on impact. We have that. We know in the long run, this other literature makes them adjust. We have that. And then the speed of adjustment is really just the depreciation. Steve.
Question about modeling. So you did not include a mechanism, used to get some attention, that increases the minimum wage crowd out general human capital accumulation on the job. Is that because you just don't want that complexity, or you're kind of persuaded by the literature that's not a very important
We didn't have
mechanism?
that. We blah, blah, blah about the skill upgrading part. It is an additional layer of complexity in an already complex model.
Because that could reverse some of your long run results.
And then Bob's force could enhance some of our things if the firms start not entering, and then we have a lost set of firms to go through. So there are two forces, these two big forces that are in the background that we could sign which way they go. And then, but those are not the forces we're highlighting here. Let me do three things quick before I do. I'm just going to show you three. One is, how does the transition affect the welfare dynamics relative to the steady state? Let's go to the $15 minimum wage, which is going to be on the right side of this picture. The black, the dotted line is the steady state long run effect that I showed you before. A $15 minimum wage makes certain workers worse off in the long run, others better off, some workers no effect. The solid line is what would happen if I integrate over the whole dynamics and not just look at the steady state. And you can see the gains to workers at the bottom are going to be higher, not quite as bad when you incorporate all those short run gains. And it could be quantitatively large in terms of doing this. So here, even in our model, a $15 minimum wage, helps a chunk of workers over the long run. Now, it still has a negative effect on the bottom, but not quite as negative you would get just from the pure neoclassical story, just with the long run. Okay. Let me kind of show you a temporary change in the minimum wage. Let's go to both pictures. The left is all non-college employment. The right is going to be just for a worker who's making $750. And the key things I'm showing you here is just what happens if we have a transitory minimum wage. The red is large, $15. The blue is small. The key thing is, from temporary changes in minimum wage, you only get the gains and you have none of the costs. So suppose you increased once the nominal minimum wage to $15 and let it deflate away by 5% a year over time. Firms aren't going to respond to the temporary change because workers tomorrow are going to be relatively cheap again. And so they're not going to adjust their production structure. So temporary changes in the minimum wage, you get all the gains without the firms substituting away. Now,
Basically, if it's unindexed.
if it's not now, suppose you did that every year,
And you don't do it again.
then you do it again, and you don't do it again. So there's
You got 2 minutes.
yeah, and so then the last result I'm going to show you now is what happens when we add an EITC just as a comparison. And so so for those who are unfamiliar, so the EITC gives you kind of a subsidy to work a little bit, then it kind of plateaus for some range, and then the subsidy starts phasing out. And so you're starting to face kind of a negative tax rate, or early on, a positive tax rate later on. And so what we're going to do is we're going to expand the minimum EITC in our model. How are we going to do that? We're going to fund it by taxing profits. And we're going to fund it by taxing profits by exactly the same amount of loss of profits from a $15 minimum wage. So this is apples to apples in terms of profit losses from a $15 minimum wage and the expansion of the EITC. And so now we're going to ask what happens when we expand the EITC in this model by playing around with these marginal tax rates, making them negative at the bottom and then phasing them out over time. And there's some degrees of freedom of how big the peak is or how high the slope is. But all of that is going to be second order to the point we want to make is look at the welfare to low skilled workers on employment on the right panel or the left panel, income in the middle panel, and welfare on the left panel between the minimum wage in solid lines and the EIT expansion in the red lines. And you can see in the long run, the EITC actually makes low wage workers better off relative to the minimum wage. You could if you want to help low wage workers, expanding the EITC is orders of magnitude better than the minimum wage. Now, why is that? Because when the government pays the marginal cost, the firms aren't paying any of the additional costs to these workers, so they don't face the incentive to substitute away from them. And if anything, this is my last picture, and then I'll conclude on the next slide. If anything, this is the time path of the dynamics of an EITC for, again, a 750 worker and then some higher paid worker in the red line. But the key thing is look at the blue line, the worker 750, they get a gain on impact, but the gain grows over time for exactly the same reason we were talking about earlier on, is that firms are going to hire more of these workers, and then they're going to start adjusting their capital stock to those types of workers. They're not paying the cost of making them more expensive, but they are hiring more of them. And so the time dynamics actually go the other direction relative to the minimum wage. So part of our paper is we have a framework that kind of thinks about these time dynamics, and different policies go in even different directions. The minimum wage makes low wage workers really better off in the short run, but worse off in the long run. The EITC makes them kind of better off in the short run, but even better off in the long run because they face different incentives to adjust their input mix. And so that's kind of what the goal of the paper, and this is my last slide to conclude, is thinking that these transition dynamics seriously are going to be important when we're thinking about policy. And in particular, a lot of our empirical work is on small policies in the short run, whether it be minimum wage or EITC. Using those empirical estimates to forecast the dynamics in the long run are fraught with potential errors. And how big those errors are depend upon the monopsony power, the degree of substitutability, and the speed at which firms adjust.
Have you thought about what a wage subsidy rather than either an EITC or minimum wage? would be?
Yes, we started with that as the first best policy. If we could basically have a wage subsidy that defines the markdown, that targets the markdown, that's the first best policy. With some other tax, funded depending upon how it gets funded. With
As organizer, I have to say,
Perfect.
those who
I'm
want
done.
to go are free to go. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks.